A few years back, I landed my first real job as a flight attendant for a small regional airline based out of San Marcos, California, and I was eager and fresh out of training, ready to travel and start a new chapter in life. The airline mostly handled short domestic routes to places like Fresno, Sacramento, Eugene, and Tacoma, which seemed ideal for someone like me. At the beginning, things were pretty smooth. My shifts usually started early in the morning, which meant waking up at dawn but finishing by early evening. I lived alone in a small but comfortable apartment near the Hillcrest area, and my daily routine settled in quickly with early starts, busy flights, then quiet evenings relaxing at home before heading to bed. Roughly a month into the job, I started noticing something off. It began with a man who I later found out his name was Brian, likely in his late 30s, who started appearing on multiple flights I worked. He was always polite, reserved, and didn't immediately stand out as unusual, since seeing repeat passengers wasn't rare on these routes. So initially I dismissed it. But after spotting him a fourth time in just 2 weeks, and always on flights I was working, I started feeling uneasy. He would greet me with a polite smile and say hello, but then he'd sit quietly and stare in my direction, and there was nothing overtly threatening about him. But something about the intensity of his stare made me feel uncomfortable because it was a bit too familiar. I told myself I was overthinking it, that passengers sometimes fixate or behave oddly as an occupational hazard. But Brian's appearances started to feel less like coincidence, and on a flight heading north to Tacoma, I looked over and saw him pointing his phone directly at me. Snapping a picture, our eyes met, and he simply lowered the phone, gave a small smile, and turned away. The following day, on a different flight, I deliberately avoided glancing toward his seat, but still, while doing beverage service, I caught him repeatedly looking over, and each time I looked back, he quickly looked away. It began to feel intentional, as if he were testing boundaries to see how far he could go. At this point, my unease was undeniable, but I hadn't shared it with anyone. Not my fellow crew friends or family. Part of me felt embarrassed because nothing criminal had happened, and I didn't want to seem paranoid after all. Flight crews do sometimes attract unwanted attention. Still, Brian's actions had a calculated edge that made it hard to dismiss, and the situation escalated during an overnight layover in Eugene. After a packed day of flights, I was looking forward to winding down, and I'd checked into a hotel downtown and decided to grab dinner at a cafe nearby. As I stepped onto the sidewalk, I glanced across the street and froze. There he was. Brian stood under a lamppost on the opposite side, as if waiting, and my heart raced. Maybe he was just a traveler staying nearby. But then I remembered he'd been on my flight earlier that day, and the chances of this being a coincidence felt slim. Trying to stay calm, I crossed in the opposite direction and walked quickly to the cafe. Once inside, I sat far from the windows and kept checking the street, and halfway through dinner, the bell over the door chimed and Brian walked in. He didn't approach. Instead, he ordered a drink, sat at the counter, and looked over at me, briefly giving a slight nod, and my stomach dropped. I left quickly, barely finishing my meal, and power walked back to the hotel, glancing behind me the whole way. Luckily, I didn't see him again that night, but I barely slept. By now, it was clear his behavior had crossed the line, and I thought about reporting him, but nothing he'd done could be classified as a direct threat. Still, the fear lingered, and I started watching the passenger list more closely. Weeks went by, and I didn't see him, and I let myself relax a bit, thinking maybe it was over. Then one evening, during a short flight from Fresno to San Marcos, I saw him again, this time, seated in the front row, right by the galley, and my throat tightened. He watched me during the entire flight, completely unapologetic, as if daring me to react. And once we landed, I waited for everyone else to deboard before approaching the front, hoping to avoid him. But he lingered, taking his time. As he finally stepped off, he leaned slightly closer and said quietly, "Take care, I'll be seeing you soon." The words were harmless on the surface, but the implication chilled me. And as soon as he walked off, I stood frozen, heart pounding. I knew then I couldn't keep this to myself any longer. The next day, I reported everything to my supervisor, and security and local law enforcement were brought in. But without any direct threats or violations, there wasn't much they could do, because Brian hadn't technically broken any laws. The airline adjusted my schedule and removed me from regular flights, temporarily hoping that cutting contact would help, and it seemed to for a while. Then one night, after returning home from grocery shopping, I found a note slipped under my apartment door. The message, typed neatly on a single strip of paper, read, "You shouldn't have said anything," and my hands shook as I read it, because somehow he'd found my address. I called the police immediately. They checked building security footage, but there were no clear shots of anyone suspicious. And once again, there wasn't enough to act on. Eventually, I moved to a new apartment, changed my number, and even requested a reassignment at work. And over time, I worked hard to rebuild a sense of safety and routine. But even now, years later, I remain cautious. I glance over my shoulder more often than I should. I triple-check locks, and I avoid eye contact with passengers who stare too long. Brian never showed up again, but I live every day with the lingering fear that he might still be out there just waiting. Last winter, my uncle and aunt came to visit me in Raleigh. We spent hours catching up on the usual family matters, but at some point, the conversation drifted to unusual happenings. And my uncle isn't one for fanciful stories, so when he mentioned there was one memory that had stayed with him throughout his life, I opened my laptop ready to take notes. He gave a small smile and nodded, asking me to let readers know this was just the account of an old man, and some parts might seem hard to believe. He began by saying he had graduated from Wesleyan University in 1974, and back then finding a job wasn't difficult because companies often sent letters or made phone calls offering interviews. He wasn't interested in a dull office job, so he waited for something that truly appealed to him, and that moment arrived during a Thanksgiving flight to visit my aunt. Gazing at the blinking lights of aircraft moving through the dark sky, he fell in love with the idea of air traffic control. The steady voices and the dance of moving lights all fascinated him, and by the time he turned 27, he'd passed every exam and was cleared to work independently. Rookies didn't get to choose their first assignments, though, and instead of a major hub like O'Hare or LAX, he was sent to a little town called Eastfield, Kansas. Despite the name, there was no coast in sight, just a rural farming community. The airport there was tiny, with one short runway nestled between endless fields of grain. The day crew left by 5 p.m., but the tower stayed manned until 4 a.m., since many flight paths intersected above, and any plane in distress might need to make an emergency landing. My uncle spent those nights alone in the glass-paneled control room at the top of the tower, while a security guard named Frank dozed off downstairs near the vacant ticket counters. Most shifts passed in silence. He passed the time reading novels, solving puzzles, or whispering on the phone with my aunt. People often say air traffic control is nerve-wracking, but in Eastfield it was mostly just dull. Now and then, a small single-engine plane would call in needing landing guidance, and that routine carried on until mid-February 1979. On the night of February 20th, strong winds swept across the flatlands, but no snow had fallen. He was scheduled for the overnight watch and expected nothing but more tedium because no flights were listed. Around 1 a.m., a light aircraft called in from 30 miles north because bad weather over Lincoln had forced the pilot to look for an alternate landing spot, and my uncle checked visibility with his binoculars and began guiding the plane in. Despite rough crosswinds, the aircraft touched down safely, and he lifted the binoculars again to double-check and froze. A woman was walking along the runway. She was barefoot, wearing only a thin summer dress with no coat, and it was below freezing. More disturbing was how she had gotten there. Because there were no nearby roads or vehicles, she hadn't flagged down the plane or called for help. She just stood there. Puzzled, my uncle grabbed the radio. "Do you see a woman on the runway?" he asked the pilot. The man sounded calm but confused and stepped out to check. And through the binoculars, my uncle saw him approach the woman and speak. Then she leaned close to his ear, and for 10 seconds they stood motionless. Suddenly, the pilot straightened, spun, and ran back to his plane as the engine roared to life. My uncle radioed urgently, trying to get the pilot to wait, but he ignored every call, and the plane sped down the runway and climbed into the dark sky. A wave of static filled the radio, then a single chilling word came through clearly: "Run." He sat back, trying to make sense of it all, then remembered the woman. When he raised the binoculars again, she was staring directly at the tower from 200 yards away, eyes stretched wide. Then, with no snow under her bare feet, she began running straight toward him. And though he'd spent 6 years in the Marines and thought he'd seen it all, terror gripped him and he called Frank, but there was no answer. He looked down just in time to see the tower's front door burst open, and instinct sent him into the tiny restroom beside the radar console. He locked the door, and outside, chaos erupted as equipment crashed. Drawers slammed and footsteps pounded. One loud bang struck the bathroom door so hard the handle rattled, then silence. He stayed hidden until morning light crept under the door, and at 7:45 a.m. The day controller Terry arrived. He swore aloud when he saw the mess and unlocked the bathroom door, and the room had been trashed. Radios were torn from their panels, monitors were broken, and papers were scattered. The police came, took statements, but found no clues, and repairs took nearly 2 weeks. Frank was fired for sleeping through the incident. They talked about installing security cameras, but it didn't happen right away. And trying to rationalize, my uncle convinced himself it was a disturbed woman from a nearby town. The memory faded until it felt like a dream. He returned to work on March 4th, and the snow kept falling as days passed without incident. Then late one evening, a private jet radioed in, because turbulence and icing forced them to make an emergency landing. It was bigger than the planes the Eastfield Strip usually handled, but emergencies made exceptions. As my uncle gave clearance and watched the snowy runway, the woman appeared again. She stood at the far end, barefoot dress, fluttering eyes wide and unblinking. He realized she had never blinked the first time either. He ordered the jet to circle, but the pilot said they couldn't stay airborne, so my uncle reluctantly cleared them, heart pounding. He rushed downstairs and locked the outside door, then returned to the console. From the window, the runway was empty, maybe she'd gone. Just then a crash sounded from below, and the metal door groaned. He couldn't tear his eyes from the radio as loud steps echoed on the stairs. Deliberate and angry, he forced his voice steady, giving the final landing instructions, and behind him, the office door creaked as he was frozen. A cold breath touched his neck, then a whisper, "Come down to the field." The voice was low, laced with fury, colder than the wind outside, and the jet landed safely. The breath disappeared, and the steps retreated. He turned and saw the room empty, and the guard arrived, and they searched every corner but found nothing. Police found only a single trail of footprints from the field to the tower, with none leading back. The snow should have shown any movement, but that was all they found. He worried others would think he was drunk or delusional, but he knew what he saw. And without hard proof, he kept the details mostly to himself. Spring came early, and by April the snow had melted, and green shoots filled the fields. He thought the nightmare had ended. But one warm night, a cargo plane reported engine trouble. So he guided it in until movement on the tarmac caught his eye. She was back, skin now, gray dress, torn hair, wet despite no recent rain. A fuel truck driver nearby froze, and she whispered to him. He backed away in fear, jumped in his truck and fled as the horn howled into the cornfields. My uncle called the guard, but he was outside inspecting the fence, and alone again he felt the tower vibrate as she climbed the exterior staircase. It was bolted to the tower wall like a fire escape, and he heard her bare feet hit each step. The pilot's voice crackled through the radio, asking for coordinates, and my uncle replied in a thin voice. Staring at the ceiling hatch that led to the platform, the clangs grew louder. The hatch creaked and wind rushed in, but it felt warmer than the chill already in the room. Her head appeared eyes wider than ever. She crawled in on hands and knees, her skin bluish from cold. Though the night was mild, she stood and stared at him, never at the equipment. The cargo plane landed, rumbling the windows. She flinched, turned, and walked across the room. Her foot pressed on shattered glass. Blood marked her steps, but she didn't stop. She climbed the opposite ledge and stepped out into nothing. They searched below the tower, but found no body, no blood outside, just the spots inside. Those stains never washed out, even after being painted over. My uncle finished his tale by saying he transferred to Oregon 6 months later. He never saw her again. But on some sleepless nights, he swears he hears footsteps on metal stairs and feels breath on his neck. He doesn't know if she was human or something older using a human shell. But every winter he scans local news from rural areas, hoping to see no strange stories. So far nothing, and that silence frightens him even more. He folded his hands and stared at the floor when he finished, and my aunt touched his shoulder and told him the coffee had gone cold. But he didn't respond. I saved the file, closed my laptop, and felt the weight of a Kansas night I'd never experienced. My uncle has lived a long life, but when he speaks of those nights in the tower, his voice still shakes like static on a frozen runway. It had been many years since I last flew, but my grandson insisted I attend his college graduation in Miami, and he found the most affordable red-eye flight available, East Sky Flight 2094, leaving San Francisco at 11:55 p.m. and arriving just after 8 a.m. the following morning. I'm 69 and use a cane, so the gate agent graciously allowed me to pre-board, and my seat 14B was on the aisle about halfway down the right side of the cabin. According to the boarding screen, 14A, the window seat was unoccupied, and having the extra space beside me felt like a small blessing. After placing my purse under the seat and pulling a coat over my knees, I settled in and watched the steady flow of passengers file past. Most looked tired hoods, pulled up earbuds, and clutching paper coffee cups with jittery fingers. When it seemed boarding was almost finished, a man quietly entered my row. He didn't pause to check his ticket. Instead, he simply turned, stepped into 14A, and sat down. I felt the brush of his wool coat against my sleeve as he moved past, and his head was bowed, his chin buried in a gray scarf. He had no carry-on, no drink, and his hands, encased in dark gloves, rested neatly in his lap. Trying to be polite, I whispered "long night," but he didn't respond. So I tried again. Miami should be warmer than this, but still nothing. I gave a small laugh, more to myself than to him, and turned toward the aisle as the cabin lights dimmed as we prepared for takeoff. I expected him to buckle up, but his belt was already fastened. Perhaps he had secured it before I noticed. As the plane climbed, it rattled the way they do on uneven air currents, but my seatmate remained absolutely still. His shoulders didn't move, and he sat perfectly upright, too rigid for someone planning to sleep. I noticed the yellow seatbelt sign glowing softly against his coat's coarse fabric, and each thread looked damp and faintly sticky, as if he'd been walking through a light drizzle. About an hour later, the flight attendants began their quiet service. The cart rolled forward, offering pretzels and water. When it reached our row, one of the attendants leaned toward me and asked anything to drink, and I asked for ginger ale. She glanced at the man beside me, and for him, she asked, puzzled. And I whispered, "He hasn't said a word." She leaned slightly toward him and said, "Sir," but there was no reaction. She paused, then placed a small water bottle on his tray, and moved on. I sipped my ginger ale. The carbonation sharp against the back of my throat, and his gloves looked odd matte, as though they absorbed light rather than reflected it. I also realized I hadn't seen his breath mist in the cold cabin air. I must have dozed off because I woke up to near darkness. Only the aisle markers glowed, and the flicker of a movie 3 rows ahead lit the space faintly. My watch showed 3:07 a.m., and my neck ached. As I adjusted in my seat, I noticed the pressure of his coat sleeve against my arm. It felt firm, as though he'd leaned in while I slept. The pressure was constant, not the occasional jostle from turbulence. I shifted away slightly but couldn't move far due to the armrest. "Sir, could you give me a bit more room?" I said gently, but he didn't answer. I pressed the call button, but nothing happened. Maybe the bulb had burned out. Instead of waiting, I decided to head to the lavatory, and I rose, carefully stepped into the aisle, and walked toward the rear galley. But the man didn't move. There were only 3 people in line, 2 teens and a businessman, and as I glanced back down the aisle, I noticed that seat 14A appeared empty. The headrest was all I could see, bathed in a faint blue light. I squinted unsure because it looked unoccupied. A chill swept through me had he followed me. I hadn't heard any steps behind me, and when I returned, the man was back sitting motionless. I settled into my seat again, heart pounding. I tried to calm myself and rest, but I listened intently for the sound of his breathing, and there was nothing, just the steady hum of engines and occasional clinking from first class. As dawn approached, a pink hue peeked through the opposite windows, the cabin lights flickered on, and the lead attendant announced our descent, asking everyone to raise their seat backs, but the man beside me didn't move. I kept my focus on small tasks, folding my blanket, adjusting the strap on my purse until the wheels touched down. We landed at 8:11 a.m., the runway bordered by Florida greenery and people unbuckled, stood and reached for overhead bags. I waited for someone to assist me with my cane, and when I finally stood, the man hadn't budged. His hands remained folded, eyes fixed downward. I touched his sleeve, intending to say goodbye or excuse myself, and the wool was ice cold, colder than the window glass. I shuffled down the aisle and into the jet. Bridge and a young flight attendant hurried up to me asking, "Ma'am, were you in 14B?" I said yes. Was anyone in the window seat? I hesitated. A man in a gray coat. Her expression tightened, and our records show 14A was unoccupied. No one should have been seated there. He was there the whole flight, I insisted. Another attendant appeared with a tablet, brows furrowed, as she reviewed the manifest. The boarding count matched perfectly, every assigned seat, filled no extras. I felt dizzy, maybe a last-minute standby. They exchanged looks and said gate logs don't show anything. One of them guided me to a chair, while the other went back on board. She returned a few minutes later, visibly unsettled. The seats empty, the belt still crossed. I asked them to check the cameras. They assured me they would, and I left feeling uneasy but tried to explain it away as dim lighting fatigue, maybe my aging eyesight. Later at my son's house, I recounted the story, and he offered a half smile, half frown, and asked, "Do you have any proof?" Then I remembered I'd snapped a photo during boarding, intending to brag to my daughter about flying alone, and I opened the gallery. There was row 14, my seat, and an empty window, no gray coat, no gloves. But I remembered the coat's scratchy feel as clearly as the phone in my hand. I could still sense its weight against my arm. I even recalled the musty scent of damp wool. I tried to enjoy the family celebration that day, but unsettling thoughts crept in, and by nightfall, lying in bed, I replayed every detail. The silent man, the untouched bottle of water, the strange cold of his coat. I wondered if some travelers moved differently, passing through flights unseen, slipping past logs and security footage, needing only a seat and the presence of another nearby. Perhaps he meant no harm. Maybe he just didn't want to fly alone. The next morning, curiosity outweighed fear, and I called East Sky's customer service. After being transferred several times, I reached a supervisor, and I asked if anything had been found in seat 14A, any personal belongings. She said no, only a sealed bottle of water. Then she paused. "Are you the one who filed the incident note?" I replied yes. She hesitated. The flight team reviewed the footage and manifest no one ever entered that seat. I thanked her and hung up. My hands trembled, but not from cold. I scrolled through my contacts until I found my late husband's number still saved. Even though he'd passed away 3 years ago, I tapped it knowing it wouldn't connect. I just wanted to hear a voice, any voice in the stillness. Outside, distant traffic rumbled like airplane engines.